All right, so module 6, then, design components, accordions. Why does that say, huh? Did I click on the right one? Module 5, sorry. Module 6. Tell you what, I'm going to get my reading glasses on. That's what happens when you look at a screen too often, right? It's not good for you, I'll tell you. Oh yeah, that's a 5, it's not a 6. Cool, so what we're going to do is also, if we head over, we're going to open up a tab as well. So we're going to have a couple of things. We'll have our code editor fired up. We can work locally here for the moment. This one doesn't need any kind of remote access. So we can work locally, but I do want to have the get Bootstrap. And head over to the documentation. And that should bring you to the quick start page. So we'll just leave that open. So we want our documentation handy on a tab. And we'll download the code, the lesson files code here. It's not very big. Okay, so make sure Windows users right-click and extract all. Please, I plead of you. I beg you. Okay, and as soon as you do that, of course, throw the zip archive in the trash in case you are in case you are tempted to open that. Throw the zip out. You should have a lesson files folder here. I don't know why mine says 4. Weird. You should have a folder in there called lesson files. Okay. And in our code editor, we'll open up a folder from File Open. Oops. So you should have a CSS directory with custom.css, custom.js. The image folder we won't really be using those two anyway, but we open up index.html here. So you should see it should look kind of sort of like that. Then open up that template, if you would, also in the browser. And should kind of look like that. So if you can right-click the screen here, inspect. I'm using the Chrome developer tools. If you want to use another browser, they all have some great features. And we head over to the toggle device toolbar here. And we take a look at. Let's pull up a instead of just the generic responsive, we'll pull up a. I don't know. Let's pull up the iPhone 6, for example. And we can see here. I'll just use my finger on that. You can see, imagine we've got a situation where there's a fair bit of text-based content. There could be images or videos or other kind of vectors or any kind of other kinds of content in here. But imagine on the small screen, there's a fair bit of content, and but maybe only one of these headings and blocks you really want the user to have open at a time. So we can save a lot of space by just kind of grouping those 3 content areas under heading 1, 2, and 3, grouping them under and we use the metaphor as an accordion, collapse them, and only open one of those in a group at a time, collapsing the other 2, right? So again, many of these kind of user interface patterns that we're going to be responsible for suggesting when we come up against design problems are going to be based on metaphors, right? So the tradition continues. So this is the accordion. Now in Bootstrap, there's a couple of things we're going to deal with. We're going to deal with, in order to build this out, we're going to deal with, we head over here to our components. We're going to use two different components to build out the accordion. So we're going to leverage more than one component and cobble this together. The first is the collapse component, right, where we you may have some amount of content, and with by clicking on it, you can slide open and close that. So that's the one part. The second design component is the card, right? And a card is a kind of a design pattern. You might see this. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, you know, say you're on Spotify and you have a Spotify account. Go and take a look at the dashboard for Spotify on your tablet or your desktop. You'll see cards for albums, right? And they'll expand and contract, but there'll be this repeating pattern of there's the album art cover, the name of the song, you know, or the playlist, or so on and so forth, and a little button that might say play this or something like that. So cards are very common, kind of, and there's all kinds of permutations of the card pattern or component where they have in here, where they might include images, they might include calls to action, buttons, or something like that, maybe headers or whatnot. So we're going to use this pattern in combination with the collapse component to build out the accordion, right? And this is it's super cool because it just with relatively little markup on the front end. Once you understand what each of these components do, and we leverage the CSS in this library, we can build something that's really robust and it works really well, and it's happy in in any environment, whether it's touch or desktop on any screen size. It's really, really cool. So anyway, hopefully you'll have fun with this and see lots of uses for it too. So, okay, so I digress. Let's head back and take a look at the code. Is that big enough on the back row? Is that good? Yeah? You don't need glasses yet. Probably wouldn't be good enough for me. All right, so first things first, by now that this should start to feel fairly routine, right? If we're going to use a CSS library, we need access. We either need to download or clone the repository through Git, or we use a download it directly from the website, or use a content distribution network. I'm going to argue when we're in the design phase, very often when we're doing user interface designs, we are not working with a fully fledged application. We're building maybe each of these kind of, if we look at the user information architecture, we're looking at different templates that have to be built to maybe then be powered by an application. So we're looking at building out, getting those functional first, and then plugging them into the back end in some way. So to that end, sometimes just quickly using a CDN just to get access to it is the quick and dirty way to kind of just get it going. Do that, get a functional prototype up and running like we have today. But then ultimately, maybe you want to be downloading and hosting this CSS on your own server, right? For any number of reasons. Cool. So we'll head over to getting started on Get Bootstrap. First of all, we'll use the CDN here, copy this for the CSS. And I'm going to, oh no, don't do this to me. Okay. So I don't have the screen real estate. If it looks like, just be aware when you're following along here. You can see here how this looks like 2 lines, but really, if you refer to the line numbers here, you'll see that this is just line 9 continued, wrapped around. Don't break to a new line on your code. Just keep typing. You probably have more width than this display can handle. Okay, so just be mindful of my line numbers on the left. save that to make sure that we got all of that code. If we reload the page, we should see immediately an improvement on good old, what is that? The iPhone, on the good old iPhone 6. Let's downgrade to the iPhone 5. Ooh, there, look at that. A little less capable screen. That's cool. There's the Nexus 5X. That is awesome. Okay, so next thing's next. Step 2 is all the way at the bottom. We're going to need the JavaScript libraries. jQuery, they use one called popper.js, which is really for tooltips and pop-ups and things like that. It's super lightweight. It's really cool. And of course, the Bootstrap JavaScript. So we're going to grab that as well. Shouldn't be any. When we refresh, we should be looking up here in the Dev Tools. There shouldn't be any errors reporting in on the console, right? So we should be able to we should get the styles and all that kind of thing. So that's cool. All right, back we go. Step 3, of course, for the Bootstrap layout, the way it works. Of course, we need a fixed fluid or a fixed width container for proper alignment and padding. So is the content on the UI going to take the full width of the screen no matter what it is, or are you going to kind of automatically center it using kind of a fixed width that might change with those Bootstrap breakpoints, right? With mobile and then small, medium, large, extra large, and bigger. So you have to make that decision. So we're going to just use a div element for that. Container. So with the generic div, of course, and I'll be looking for this in your work, cut that out, and just before we close out the paragraph down here, close out that div. So the div is a child of the body element. Watch your tab and comment this. I have no idea what this is. This is the class container. So if you've got a generic div, I would like to see the tail end of that div. Good practice. Tell me what div it is. To make sure that works, refresh your page, and then we should have the beginnings of layout. Here I can see with the breakpoints. Snap, snap, snap. Okay. Very cool. Step 3. Step 4, basic page level containers. Just because you're using a framework doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to build a good grid, a good scaffold for the content, right? So right inside the class container, then we'll have the page level header element, and we'll surround that header element. We'll surround the H1 and the paragraph. So put these two things in here. What's really, really cool too is, sure, we've got a primary heading and kind of a subhead, or a kind of a tagline or a lead-in or something like that, whatever you want to call it. If you look at some of the utilities, we can modify. There's some really good typography features in, and we'll talk about typography obviously in a lot more detail. But if we look here, we have, you can go to the typography. And we go to utilities. Is it text? Utilities text. And you can see there are all kinds of ways to manipulate typography. Is that it? Page looks different. Oh, utilities. Okay. Oh, this is for content. No, I've got that wrong. It's in the content section. I steered you wrong. Under content, sorry. And then typography. That's what I want. The heading was throwing me off. So you can see here, it gives you a sense of where the kind of typography is right under the box. But if you wanted to, you know, do some interesting text treatment, you don't have to move right away to your custom CSS. You know, use the tool for what it's good at. They've already built this out. You can use classes, so text muted. I've used one of these display, I think display 3, to tone down. These are all H1s, right? But maybe you want to just kind of de-emphasize an H1, scale it back a little bit. So, and these are all built rather nicely using typographic scales too. So amazing stuff, really, really cool. But I digress. So there's the header, and then of course we want the main element. And the main element will go all the way down here just after the last piece of bogus text there. And then, of course, I'll put a footer, page level footer. And I don't need a comment after the main. There is only one main element on the page for a valid HTML template. That won't do anything really of anything noticeably visually to the page, but it's all there now. Awesome. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to identify what parts of what pieces of content on the page are going to serve as this widget. So your page may, of course, include more content than this. So you have to kind of carve out what piece of the content, like where are those bits of content and those headings that you want to open and collapse, right? Because there may be other elements of the page that you want to be uninvolved in the whole thing. So in this case, to keep it simple, I've included a couple of H2s, or 3 H2s, and after each one of them a simple paragraph. So everything in the main in this example, we're going to identify as the accordion, right? So step 5, surround the entire collection of content with a div element to serve as the root for the accordion. I have to see where do I line this up with? Where's my main? So that's inside the div. It should be right here. So we'll create a div. And we're going to give it an ID. Watch your spelling. Did I talk about the role yet? Suitable ID and role. So, okay. So you're free to give it any ID. This ID is here nor there in terms of the Bootstrap. That's totally up to you, because you may have more than one accordion on the page. So they have to have their own. You decide what that's called. I'm just calling it. It could be Accordion 1 if there's two of them on the page, and the second one's Accordion 2. What is fixed here is you do need to define an ARIA role attribute for, and it is called tab list. So for accessibility features, this is identified as the role attribute tab list, which is really cool. But these roles that they've looked at, so these different UI roles, this list has identified certain user interface patterns that are common, and said this is and so screen readers and other accessibility software recognize how these function, and the best way to serve them up in different ways if it's not visual. So the role of this whole thing is basically a tab list. So there isn't much difference really between the accordion and the tab list. Like say you go to, I'll show you. Say maybe we go to, let's pick on Best Buy. Actually, this is a well done website. So let's go shop here. Well, let's take a look at drones. Those are crazy. I don't know what. Oh, jeez. Whoa. That looks like a crazy drone. So if we look at here, and we look down here, this is a tab panel, right? So this UI component here. So this entire thing here, see all the content that swaps out? Quite a bit. So all of this would be considered a tab panel in terms of the role. All of that content would be wrapped with that role attribute. And really, the tab panel isn't much different than the accordion in not so many ways. You have a couple of headings or links or tabs that reveal one content out of a list at a time. Very often there's several tabs here. Yeah, some good UI work at Best Buy. I like that. So tab list, we've got that div, the ID accordion, and of course I want to close that out just before the main element here. And add a comment, and this is ID. I'll use the ID. What's your spelling? Accordion with an O, 2 C's. Okay? Just because I decided to call it accordion and I made that up, it doesn't necessarily mean we won't be using that in the widget for some functionality. In fact, if you wait, there's an important piece of functionality that we'll need to be aware of, the encapsulating element and its ID. So we'll need that. We'll just put it away in our pocket. So role is tab list. That's cool. Done. Step 6. Create a section element for each heading and content pair using the Bootstrap card component. So by adding the card class. So this is where we're going to look at, okay, let's delineate each of the different 3 pieces of this accordion that are going to work as a unit, right? We're going to call them each cards, so that we can take advantage of the card styling components in the Bootstrap CSS. So here we have H2 and a paragraph. So to encapsulate that in here, we could use a section element. Why would I use a section element? Well, let's take a look. Mouse over the section. Represents a generic section of a document or an application. A thematic grouping of content. This is a good choice for this content, because the heading and this content are grouped together for a specific reason. Right? Product details, product specifications, user or ratings, customer ratings, right? So, and the interesting thing, I mean, not to give. Let's go over here to, where's my components? Components, head over to collapse. So if you look at the generic code here, head down to the accordion example, you'll see, right, we have got 3 divs already right off the bat. They don't all have to be divs. They're showing you this because they can't make any assumptions in terms of the application you're using it for. That's your job, right? Not Bootstrap's job. They have to provide generic markup that's functional. You do that thinking. So anyway, so I'm going to say these are each sections. It also makes for much more readable code. You'll see when you look at your markup here, you compare it to the code in Bootstrap. For the way we're using this, it's much more readable. So close out the section. And encapsulate the H2 and the paragraph. Yep.
How is it with sections? From what I saw, sections were supposed to be like for stuff that is completely different semantically.
You mean the content inside the section?
Semantically, what's section good for?
It's still a fairly generic element, so it's still the application is still pretty open in terms of how you might interpret that. But if you think of, I often like to think of a book. Like if you look at a chapter within a book, sometimes a chapter can be very big, and then you may have different sections within that chapter identified or delineated by headings, or in this case, subheadings or sub-subheadings. So I guess I just look at the document outline, and that's I like that question because. For example,
so technically sections should be inside article?
You can divide an article into sections.
Right.
You can have a user interface that has different sections, and each section contains a number of articles. So you could do either. Right? It just depends on the content, right? Let the content guide you. Don't try and shoehorn the content into a structure that you feel is appropriate. Just take a look at the content. If you can provide some sort of rationale for why you chose that, it makes sense. That's the art part of it, not so much the science part of it. It's a good question. Sometimes the answer to that can be it depends, and I guess that's not very entirely helpful. But as long as you can justify why you used an element, I'll buy it. Like I'll say, okay, yeah, you gave that some thought. I'll buy that. Maybe I wouldn't have marked it up that way, but it's good, it's logical, and it's clean, simple code. I like it. Let's go. Let's move on, right?
Okay.
Hopefully that answered. That was a good question. But so each section, what we're going to do also with these sections is we're going to add these. We're going to add a class equal to card. So for each of these section elements, add a class card to the start tag, times 3. Cards are cool. I like the whole idea of cards. It's such a modular, fun, flexible way of thinking about content, and also from a UI perspective, when you think about chunking information, it makes a large piece of information very very easy to digest. For example, we'll head over. I'll log into my. So you can find the web player here. So there we have a good example of that kind of cool Frank Sinatra. So you can see how, I mean, we take and really well done in terms of responsiveness.
Amazing user
it's cool. They've done their homework, right? They get it. It's really easy to find your way around Spotify. I mean, I don't have to do any head scratching at all. I love it. It's really, really cool. But I like that this design pattern of cards, right, is very pervasive. The same thing on, if you ever tried Google Play, if you like, you know, you like kind of the music as a service type thing, you'll see that their UI has similar kind of constructs. Okay, so let's see what that does to our. And now you can see here, it's very subtle. There's just what they do with each of these cards is just add a very soft rounded corner, border radius to each of these with a soft. I think there's going to be just a little bit of a hint of a drop shadow, a box shadow on the bottom. If that's not working, right? We're starting to you know, crunch together a lot of markup. If it's not working, always, you know. Always check your markup. Okay, make sure you've got, you know, in this case it's not going to be a CSS problem because we're not doing any CSS. It's going to be a markup problem if something is not rendering properly, or you've mistyped, you've typed a class. The markup, this checker won't capture if you misspelled card though, for example, right? Like if there's a typo in here, it won't capture that. So just make sure you've got your validator at your fingertips. Cool. Using the Bootstrap card, that's right. Okay, so step 7, identify the heading for each card with a header element. So what we're going to do is inside the section, we're going to add another header. But this time, that header will be for the section, not the page level header. So we'll go in here and say, inside the section, header. And that header will encapsulate the H2. Okay, a couple of things though. In order to leverage the card component, we're going to need a class on this. And the class is equal to the card-header. Save that, have a look, just to see what's going on here. For the collapsible component, this header is going to have a role. So this, you'll notice the whole thing is a tab list. Within that tab list, obviously we want to have a tab. So there's a couple of metaphors at play here. The idea of a tab panel or a tab list and the idea of an accordion, right? So the role is tab. And we're going to give this a unique identifier. This will come in later. We'll call this heading, capital, I'll use camel case, heading 1. So make sure in the header you have those 3 attributes and values. And this accessibility features and technologies are going to become more and more important as regulation starts to take effect and starts to become applicable to large organizations, government, things like that. Right? There's going to be a lot of work not only building stuff like this from the outset, but also retrofitting old stuff. You guys are going to be called upon to, they're going to be like, we've got this accessibility problem, our site's a mess, or our web application's a mess, or our banking app is a disaster. And you'll be like, all right, let's go. How long is this going to take? Well, probably about, given the size of the app, probably about 3 months. Wow, okay. Yeah, it's going to be a big deal, right? So getting used to building things, it's so much easier to build it from the outset like this, rather than come back after the fact and retool things for accessibility. Accessibility, just like security, shouldn't be a bolt-on. It should be something you think about right at the start, right? And you start by doing that with your semantic elements first, and then also by using these. It's not just about alt tags on images, right? That's like the lowest hanging fruit. If you don't do that, what the heck are you doing? So anyway, so add these classes onto each of those headers. Well, actually, you have to build the headers out. So build each of the same thing here. You'll see this even pulls this role value even pulls up. This is Visual Studio Code, so that's pretty cool. ID in this case is heading 2. Heading 3. Tidy up your formatting as you go. Oh, actually. So in each section, we should have a section level header plus the subhead inside the H2, and that header should have class card header, extending this class here. Should have the role of tab for accessibility and the ID heading 3, which we'll use later for functionality. And if everything's cool, you should have 3 cards stacked right on top of each other. If something's not rendering properly, that's okay. Tap your neighbor on the shoulder, head to your, validator, try and find the source of the problem. We got step 6, step the header. Step 8, add a utility class. All right. So one of the things, and this is really cool. You can see the accordion example here. These on the documentation, the headings inside the header or inside the card heading element are kind of vertically centered, right? Ours, not so much. They're kind of there's a little bit of extra space underneath there. So there are some utility classes also we can do. There's no reason why you can't go into your custom CSS and just address that if you want. Either with, controlling the bottom margin or padding, or changing the relative positioning or something like that. But sometimes that's the hard way. Exhaust all of the possibilities first in the utility classes in Bootstrap. So we go to the utilities. There's all kinds of positioning, sizing, spacing, margin. So classes that set margin bottom or padding bottom. So what we're going to do here is, do they have an example of the MB? No, they don't. So it's margin bottom 0, and I'll show you how what the class looks like this. If we want to bring that H2 down here, on the H2, we actually add a class equal to margin bottom dash 0. And so watch the first one here. Right? It's a little thing, but it's a million little things that make for great design, right? It's attention to that detail. You could leave it the way it is, but it just doesn't look quite as nice. So add that onto each of the 3 headings there. And off you go. So if you got that, if you got this far, you've earned yourself your afternoon coffee. So go and take a breather, get up and stretch. And when we come back, we're going to start supercharging this and starting to get the functionality into this, so it works like flawlessly. All right, now it's going to get crazy. This is going to net nuts. All right. Cool. So, we've got our 3 sections. Each of those are our card. We've got a card header. That looks good. We've cleaned up the heading inside. It's aligned properly with a margin bottom 0. 7, 8. Now we're going to add a utility class. Oh, we've already done that, so we're on step 9. Surround each of the paragraphs with the div. So now we have to identified the card header here, and we're using a header element to do that. So we're using a sectioning element. We could, for the card body, we could just put the class card body on the paragraph. The only problem, can you see any problem though with that? If I define the paragraph itself as a card body? What if there's 2 paragraphs? Now I've hamstrung myself, right? So sometimes you have to add that extra little layer. Yeah?
Should it be div or article?
It would only, it could be an article. It would depend, if we're going to use an article, that means that the content within that article would make sense out of context. So if you tore that out and syndicated that elsewhere on another application or on another site, it would totally make sense without the rest of that content. Right. That's the only caveat to the article thing. But yes, always ask those questions. Is there something more meaningful than a generic element like div? In this case, I don't know. I'll let it go and just I'll use the div. You know how I feel about div. Whatever. That's okay. I mean, I can see a time when there's an HTML element called card. I can see it happening, right? What happens is people use things often enough, and these user interface patterns happen, and then people are like, hey, could we have like a card element? And then, all right, it makes its way into the specification, or organically browsers just start supporting it, because some people see HTML as a living spec, and that's the way it goes. Sorry, Raj, you have a question?
Yeah, can we add the class in itself, like paragraph tag, like p tag?
Add the class to the paragraph tag itself?
Yeah.
We could. The only challenge then becomes, and you'll see when it renders, what if this particular card, you wanted to add another paragraph to that card? Then you're kind of stuck, right? So anyway, so the class for this one is called card body. Okay, so surround the paragraph, clean up your formatting. And I'll surround each and every paragraph here. Now the only thing I would like to comment out here, so I'll say dash or class card body. something doesn't make sense here. There we go. So inside, after the header, inside the encapsulating section, and encapsulating each of the paragraphs is a div class card dash body. And if everything's cool, you'll see suddenly now we've got a little bit of white space here. It's looking smooth. Okay, if you've got rendering problems, again, likely it's an HTML issue. Tap your neighbor on the shoulder, head over to the good old validator, fix the first error in the list. Likely one error will perpetuate, a series of other problems. Fix that, come back, check it again, you should be okay. It's going to be 9.5 times out of 10. It's not going to be, it's going to be a structural issue with your HTML. Or a typo in your class, that could do it. All right, so now it's starting to look pretty smooth. Now we're going to add a div element to surround each card body. Now this part may look a little bit kind of like we're adding markup just for markup's sake, but it's not really. Although this adds to the complexity of the markup, we're adding this for functionality's sake, and I think there is some validity to this. But we're going to use a div. I'm going to surround the card body with another div. So we'll go in the first one here, and we'll say, okay, because what I want to identify is the region of content that is collapsible. It will open and close. Okay, so I have to physically define that. So I'm going to say div. And I'm going to give this a class equal collapse. You spell it right. Div class equal collapse. So what I'm doing with this div is I'm saying this is the part that will collapse. So I'll just bump in the div. So now, highlighted here, you can see I'll comment the div here. Making my code a bit more readable. So save that first one. Just do the first one here. Add that div class equal collapse surrounding the card div with the class card body just for the first section. Just do that in the first section. Then go over to and you'll see right away that then collapses. It's gone. Okay. Then you'll know everything's working the way it should. There's a couple more classes and things or a couple more attributes I want to add on to that collapse. So the next thing is, notice here we have a role. This header is going to form the tab. Right? If you think of a tab panel, this is going to be the button that will control the opening and closing of this. So the role of this class equal collapse div is related, and this is called the tab panel. You can select it from the list here. So that provides assistance to assistive technologies, right? Because we don't want a screen reader reading a panel that is collapsed. You think about trying to navigate this verbally, right? It'd be different. It's a different proposition. So the role for this is a tab panel. And we're going to give this an ID. ID equal, just like we gave the header that is the tab. We're going to give this one this collapsed, this tab panel, for lack of a better term, and we'll call it collapse capital 1. I'll use camel case here. Close that out. So there we go. So inside the section, sibling of the header element, parent of the div class card body is the div class collapse. The role of this element is to function as a tab panel. We'll give it an ID collapse 1 because there's going to be 3 of them. That won't affect the rendering on the screen, obviously, because it's this class equal collapse takes care of that. Cool. So we can copy this div here, and I'll duplicate this work for the next 2 panels. So I'll go down here, and I'll do the same thing. Except I'll call this one div collapse 2. And just watch. It's going to get easy. It's easy to get lost at this point in your code. So that's where the formatting becomes your friend. And you know, like when we move this up to the server and we're generating this code, the content and outputting this template as real HTML from the app, is the app going to output this code in a nice, beautiful, formatted function like this? No. In fact, it might even linearize it all in one line to make it come down through the network really quick. It might compress it, gzip, or do something from the server. Formatting is really for you, the developer, to make sure that you keep organized. The server's going to, oftentimes servers make a horrible mess of HTML. Just like you're like, wow, how am I going to, what is that? Like, what a mess. My beautiful work, my templates, mangled hopelessly. Yeah, I know, I get it. But, you know, servers are a different monster, and their job is to get that HTML to the client, to the user agent fast, right? And intact. Doesn't have to look good. So that's when, of course, we would just use the, I mean, you can always go to the dev tools, right? And you can always look at the DOM this way, right? It'll always render your code like that, so you can make sense of what you've done. Cool, so we're in good shape. So the first one's collapsed. Did I not save it? Maybe I didn't save it. Oh, yeah, there's unsaved changes in my page. So now they're all collapsed. You should have all 3 of them collapsed. So each one, just to recap that step, each one has a unique ID. Collapse 1, collapse 2, collapse 3. Other than that, all the divs have class equal collapse and role equal tab panel for accessibility. All right. Getting closer, getting closer. So now, of course, to start with, what if we want one of the panels by default to be visible? That totally makes sense, right? You know, that shows, and it gives a visual cue to the end user that, hey, I can do something here because that looks like it's cracked open and those look closed. So without any explanation, you want the visitor to be compelled to interact with it, right? By showing them, hey, this is how this works. So how do we do that? So what we do is we add the class show to one of these collapse elements. So let's go to the first one here. It doesn't have to be the first one, but we can add another class here and say, yeah, so collapse doesn't necessarily mean collapsed. If we add another class called show, it will open this one up. Now the interface invites you to participate. And that's what you want. You want, remember good old Steve Krug? Don't make me think. Don't make the user think. Right? If we collapse all of those, they might figure it out. Maybe that it's an accordion. Maybe not. Maybe they'll say, that looks weird. Invite the user to participate. Yep. That's all I added to open one up. I think I missed the step with the anchor element. I did. I somehow skipped over step 11. Step 11. I skipped step 11. Step 11. Add an anchor element inside each of the H2. So I need something to function as the button, right? So we look here. These are simple heading elements. They can work. Headings can work as buttons, right? I can change the cursor to a pointer, right, and invite the person to click on it, and I can hover this panel here in a different color when they mouse over it. Could do, right? But what we'll do is we'll change these to anchors. So let's go inside the H2 here. And so the first H2 inside the header for this card, I'll wrap, let's break the H2 into multiple lines here. And then I'll add an anchor. And how we associate this button, or this link in this case, is you see how this has its unique ID down here for this tab panel? What I can do is I can point the href locally to this ID, this element. Right? And in the absence of JavaScript and CSS, that actually makes sense. They click on it, they move down to that section. So we're using the kind of the lowest common denominator in terms of just basic HTML functionality. But we can use that. Also, the CSS and the JavaScript in particular takes advantage of this. So I can say ID collapse capital 1. So watch your spelling. So href that H2, the text inside the H2, point that to the div, the collapse, the tab panel with the ID. Now, how we enable this collapsible toggling feature so that they can click that back and forth is an attribute, called data toggle. So we add the data toggle in here. And the data toggle is equal to collapse. So surround that text inside the H2. And now that has the ability to toggle that state. So it adds and removes that class and incorporates a CSS transition as well. All we've done is add an anchor to this to the H2, add a data toggle collapse, attribute of value, and and pointed the href to the ID for the corresponding. That's how this knows to toggle this element through the href. Awesome. So now upgrade the two other H2s to do the same thing with their respective tab panels. Making sure to change the href to point to the associated ID here. And the last one, heading 3. File save. Let's use the inspect tools and take a look at the phone experience. Not bad, but the problem is with the small screen, I've got a usability issue. The whole idea was to make use of a very small space and only have one of these open at a time, right? So somehow we have to get all three of these tab panels understanding the collapsed or open state of the other two. That's easily enough solved. So take up here, now we're on to step 13. Complete the accordion behavior. So only one collapsible component should be open at a time. So what we do is we associate each collapsed div with the parent element here. So this is a tab list here. I made up this ID, accordion. So this you can identify this whatever you want. But what I want all three of these collapsed panels to understand is that they all function as children of this, right? So I take this ID and then I head over to the div, so the collapse panel for this one here, for example. And I add an attribute called data-parent equal ID accordion. Once all three of these panels, these collapsed tab panels, are associated with that div that encapsulates all three of them, we can have that OR situation. You can have one or the other, not any at the same time. So down to the second div here, and they're all the same. Much easier. Mobile first. Got to be mobile first now, right? And the reason I focused on this instead of a tab panel is because this is more suitable to the small screen than a tab panel. A tab panel, the tabs will sit along the top, right? Maybe if we move to a bigger screen, maybe you want this accordion to change into a tab panel, right? That's where you would then leverage those breakpoints and some CSS and maybe or maybe even some JavaScript to manipulate that if that's an issue. But really, this kind of approach really works well for mobile. Cool. Where did I put step 14? I think it's at the top here. Okay. So that's all cool. What if I want to adjust this? So for example, what if I want to override some of these things in a way that kind of steps outside of the bounds of Bootstrap? That's okay. I mean, I could. First things first, I'm going to ask you, what about some of the utility classes in Bootstrap? Let's use those. Let's exhaust those until until we have nothing. Until we've no other options. Then we go into custom CSS. So let's link our custom styles here under step 14. Make sure, of course, you're linking the Bootstrap CSS first. Then, because of the cascade, actually, I'm not using XML in this one. So I'll just be consistent. So let's point to the custom.css. So then the next step is actually in custom CSS. So once that's working, head over to custom.css in the CSS folder, where you'll see step 15. I guess I better change the, hold on. Toggle. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I don't want these headings to be, I don't want the underline, and I want the ability to click anywhere here as well outside of the bounds of the anchor, right? So what I want the anchor to extend all the way across that bar, just to make it super big and really easy to, so for example, I'll head away from the mobile into the desktop, click here, nothing. So the anchor, the way this works, the anchor does not extend all the way across. The H2 extends all the way across. The Bootstrap leaves that as the default, right? But the H1 is display inline rather than, so I need to change that to block. And I also want to remove the underlining. So let's go ahead here. And we're going to have to make sure we win the specificity war, because if you remember, let's take a look at, well, first of all, let's take a look at the dev tools. Inspect this anchor here, and you can see all the CSS that's in play. The color is being managed by reboot.css, which is kind of like a CSS reset or normalize. And then it also inherits the font size, or that's for the H2. It inherits from the H2 the font size of 2 rem. And you can go through the stack here, and you can see all of the, and even card.css is affecting things like word wrap. So you can see how those various styles are being picked up through the CSS cascade. So let's go ahead, let's go and target that. We'll look at the markup. I have a, where's my, here it is. So I've got a header, a card header class here that I can use that, right? There isn't really. This is a utility class. I probably don't want to use that as a selector, but I know this. I know this is going to be here if I'm styling an accordion and I'm using headers. I know this will be here, so I can use that and maybe speak to the anchor inside the card header. So let's try and see if that works. So I'll just go class. What was it? Card-header. Card-header anchor. And we'll set the text decoration. Turn it off. Okay, so we won the war. We won the specificity war. That's the most. Just because your style, remember with CSS, just because your style comes after the CS. There's the CSS library. Just because yours comes after that doesn't necessarily. There may be a more specific selector in there, right? Not likely, but there could be, right? You want to avoid using. Putting in the important thing here. Like really, unless we are really desperate, this is an act of desperation, right? I don't want to have to break the cascade. So let's just see if you can use your selector, be as specific as you can, but no more specific. Because if you're overly specific with your selector, you may cause problems for yourself later, right? Because then it's difficult to trump that selector because it's like, it's so specific. It's like, you have to write a big, huge long selector and talk HTML, body, main, header, all this stuff. It gets crazy. So that's cool. So we got that. Let's also set the anchor so it goes across the whole page. So we'll set the display to block. Let's expand the width of that anchor element all the way across its parent, which is the H2, which is already all the way across. I should check that. Let's inspect. Isn't it? It sort of is. The header, though, has some padding in it. So that's it does go 100%, but the padding from the header is restricting some of that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, is that a problem? Let's see. Let's try it out and see if that's a real issue. So save that. Reload our page, and if we inspect this particular anchor, now the anchor goes all the way across. Yeah, it doesn't. It won't. That padding won't be there. But here, let's take a look. So here's our phone. That's not too bad. If you find that a usability error, maybe you need to then adjust that padding and have that anchor encapsulate. Yep.
Rather than expanding anchor element, can we put this in H2?
Yes. Yes, you can.
We can do target and stuff.
But I don't. Yes, but I don't want to spoil your lab. God, yes.
Why is validator screaming at the top value of the attribute role?
Which one?
In the header. If you validate it, it should scream at you for
all right.
using the tabs.
Bad value tab for attribute role on element header. Probably because let's look up the area roles. And we can go to the W3. If we look at the roles, this is the specification. So we can look at what the various role sets are, and where's my exhaustive list here? So there's role equal tab. A grouping label providing a mechanism for selecting the tab content that is to be rendered by the user. Yeah, I'm not sure why that's their own validator. I don't know. That's what we're doing in my mind. I think we're adhering to the spirit of that in this case. Yeah, but that it certainly doesn't. It's certainly choking on it. It chokes on it 3 times. So yeah. So the validator, it's a tool. It's not always. You know, if you can see something like this that doesn't make sense, look it up. You know, look up the area. Look up the role attribute and find out what are the possible values for the roles. You know. That was a good catch. I didn't even anticipate that happening. That's cool. That's crazy. So, cool. Okay. So what was it? I was going to do one more thing here. I think. Nice. Step 15. No, I think that was it. We can change the. We can also change things like the. We can look at the card, different things available to us in cards, for example. Where can I style the header differently? Header. So background and colors for different for the cards, we can change those. Using some classes, building those classes into the div class equal card, right? Let's see if I can just adjust the header card layouts. That's cool. I mean, we've just barely scratched the surface of the card component. Where's my class header? No. Text white, BG primary. We'll put this here, for example, on the div class equal card. In this case, it's not a div, it is a section. I guess I'll have to change that. I'd have to obviously change the change my link. Okay, pretty cool. I think I've got all of my 15. I think that was it. So your challenge today, should you choose to accept it, Lab 5, and I'll have these out. So I'd like you to build upon this accordion. I want to add one more card item to the accordion, 1 or 2, including some other content you wish. You can generate some Greek text using a lorem ipsum generator. The next one is I want you to try to get the H2 elements inside of the header to work as the toggle, like Raj was suggesting, right? I like it. I like the way you're thinking. So yeah, I want you to see if you can get that, and I've given you some clues in here to see if you can eliminate that extra node and just use the H2. Right? That would solve that usability problem with having just the anchor inside. It's a little narrower because of the padding in that inside that element. Since you can't have an href on an H2, you'll have to use the data target attribute. I'll leave you to figure that out. Then I'd like you to go through the documentation for the component, and I want you to add all of the area expanded attributes. So I want you to address accessibility. There's a few more little ARIA attributes that need to be attached to the H2s when they're expanded and then when they're collapsed. Okay, that's in the Bootstrap page. Then I want you to change the background color and the text color of the H2 for each of the card header elements using your custom CSS. So you can wrangle that into and make it interesting. You know? Maybe make each of those headers a different color, right? Using the nth child or do something creative, right? Have fun. Cool. So out of 5 marks, when each of those challenges are complete, you can either here I'll hand this out. You can either check these off and show me today right away. So you've got the balance. You've got the balance of your class today to chip away at that lab. If you'd like some assistance with, if you got some challenges with your assignment, also there's some time for you. I can give you a little bit of a hand with that. Give you some direction. Okay. Cool. In the meantime, I will upload this screencast. Thanks for watching.